My parents cut me off for marrying below my class. Now my wife and I built an empire, and they're begging to meet their grandkids. I'm a 29-year-old guy who grew up believing success and status were everything. In my family, emotions were secondary. Appearances were everything. My father built his empire from scratch, turning our last name into something people whispered with respect. My mother, a woman of immaculate taste, carried that legacy like a crown. Together, they shaped me into their trophy son, the one who was supposed to continue the dynasty. Every dinner in our marble dining room felt more like a board meeting than a family gathering. My father would discuss stock prices between bites of steak, while my mother corrected my posture or scolded me for speaking too casually. If I got a 98% on a test, my dad would ask who got 100, as if excellence wasn't achievement but expectation. My childhood was a performance. Success wasn't celebrated. It was required. My mother loved to remind me, we don't associate with mediocrity. She'd say it whenever I brought home friends who didn't fit her standards, kids who didn't come from good families. She'd smile politely, then whisper to my father later, he needs better influences. I learned early that love in our home was conditional. As long as I played my role, top grades, designer suits, perfect manners, I was worthy of being their son. When I got into one of the top universities in the country, my father threw a lavish celebration, inviting business partners, politicians, and socialites. I remember standing beside him, champagne in hand, as he proudly announced, "This boy will take our name to even greater heights." In that moment, I felt proud, but also trapped, because behind every compliment was an unspoken rule: you will never disappoint us. Back then, I didn't realize that the very values that made my parents proud would one day be the reason they disowned me. I met Rachel during my final year of university, of all places, at a community volunteering event my friend had dragged me to. I remember laughing when I first saw her, standing knee-deep in mud, helping build houses for families who couldn't afford them. She had paint on her jeans, dirt on her face, and the kind of smile that didn't care who was watching. It was disarming. I'd grown up surrounded by polished people, every smile rehearsed, every gesture meant to impress. But Rachel, she was real. We talked for hours that day, about music, her younger siblings, the part-time jobs she worked to pay tuition. She wasn't trying to sound impressive. She was just honest. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to perform. There was something grounding about her. She looked at me like I was human, not a resume. Of course, I didn't tell my parents about her. I could already hear my mother's voice in my head. Construction work. Public school? How? Quaint. Rachel didn't fit into the world my parents built, and deep down, I knew they would see her as a threat to it. Still, I couldn't stay away. Every weekend, I'd make excuses, study sessions, networking events, just to see her. We'd sit in her tiny apartment, eating instant noodles, listening to old records she bought at thrift stores. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt more alive than any gala or banquet I'd ever attended. One night, she looked at me and said softly, "You don't seem like them. You seem like you're trying to find yourself." I didn't know it then, but she was right. Meeting Rachel was the beginning of me finding who I really was, though it would also become the reason I'd lose everything I'd ever known. It took me 6 months to build up the courage to introduce Rachel to my parents. By then, we were serious, talking about moving in together, even dreaming about the future. But the closer we got, the heavier the guilt became. I knew my parents would never approve, yet I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, they'd see what I saw in her. The dinner was at our family estate. My mother insisted on a proper setting, which meant a 6-course meal, silver cutlery, and a chandelier worth more than Rachel's yearly income. From the moment we walked in, I could feel Rachel tense beside me. My mother greeted her with a smile so cold it could freeze glass, and my father shook her hand like he was inspecting a job candidate. "So, Rachel," my father began over appetizers, "what do your parents do?" She smiled politely. "My mom's a nurse and my dad's retired from the postal service." There was a pause, short but sharp enough to cut the air. My mother's lips twitched. "How?" "Lovely," she said, the kind of tone that dripped with judgment disguised as manners. Throughout the evening, they peppered her with condescending questions about her career goals, her financial outlook, her long-term aspirations. Rachel handled it with grace, answering every question with quiet dignity. But I could see her eyes dimming as the night dragged on. When we finally left, she sat silently in the car, staring out the window. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I've never felt so small in my life." My chest tightened. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away gently. That night, as I watched her walk into her apartment without looking back, I realized something terrifying. My love for her had just declared war on my family's pride. A week after that dinner, my mother called me to talk. Her tone was deceptively calm, the kind she used before delivering emotional executions. When I arrived, both she and my father were waiting in the sitting room, the atmosphere cold and rehearsed. "We've given it some thought," my father began, folding his hands like a CEO addressing an underperforming employee. "That girl, Rachel, she's not right for you." I tried to stay calm. "She makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" My mother laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Happiness is fleeting, darling. Stability and reputation are not. You've worked too hard to throw your future away on someone ordinary." Her voice softened, but her words hit like knives. "End it now, before it becomes an embarrassment." I told them I wasn't ending anything. My father's jaw clenched. "If you go through with this," he said, "you'll lose everything. Your trust fund, your position at the company, your inheritance. We will not bankroll poor decisions." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Every part of my life had been built within their system. My apartment, my car, my job, all connected to their empire. Walking away meant starting from nothing. I looked at my father, the man who'd taught me to stand tall, and asked quietly, "Would you really cut off your own son for loving someone?" He didn't even hesitate. "We're not cutting off our son," he said coldly. "We're cutting off a mistake." I left that house with nothing but my wallet and my keys. The same night I showed up at Rachel's door, still trembling from what I'd just done. When she opened it, I didn't say a word, just wrapped my arms around her. She didn't ask questions. She just whispered, "You're home." That was the moment I realized love might cost me everything, but losing her would have cost me even more. The morning after I walked away from my parents, everything felt eerily quiet. No calls from assistants, no reminders from my mother, no driver waiting outside. Just me, sitting on Rachel's second-hand couch staring at a chipped coffee mug and realizing for the first time in my life, I was truly on my own. We got married 3 months later in her friend's backyard. There were no champagne fountains or professional photographers, just string lights, laughter, and love that didn't need to be dressed up. I wore a $60 suit from a thrift shop, and Rachel's dress was something she'd found online for under $100. When we said our vows, her eyes were full of tears, and I remember thinking, this is what real wealth feels like. Reality hit soon after. Rent, bills, and the cost of starting over stacked up fast. I sold my designer watches and moved our few belongings into a small apartment above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the water pressure was awful, and the radiator screamed every night, but it was ours. Rachel picked up extra shifts as a receptionist while I bounced between odd jobs, doing anything to keep us afloat. One night, as we ate dollar store ramen at our rickety table, Rachel said softly, "You know, we're not poor. We just haven't grown yet." She smiled as if she believed it, and somehow her faith in me was enough to make me believe it too. That's when I dusted off an old notebook filled with startup sketches and product ideas I'd once hidden from my father because they weren't profitable enough. I told Rachel about it, expecting her to laugh. Instead, she said, "Then let's build it, together." And that's how it began. 2 people, no money, 1 dream, and a world that thought we'd already failed. Starting a business sounds romantic until you're staring at unpaid bills at 2 a.m., wondering if you've made the biggest mistake of your life. I worked out of our apartment, turning the small dining table into a makeshift office. By day, I pitched ideas to anyone who'd listen. By night, I scoured online forums, teaching myself marketing and product design. Most days ended in rejection emails or silence. Every no chipped away at my confidence. Rachel became the glue holding us together. She'd come home exhausted from double shifts, her hands sore, and still ask, "What did we build today?" Her faith felt like borrowed light, keeping me going when mine ran out. But as months passed, savings vanished. Rent notices piled up. One night, when the electricity got cut off for late payment, I broke down for the first time. "I can't do this to you," I said quietly in the dark. "You deserve better than this." Rachel turned to me, her face barely lit by candlelight. "Better than you," she whispered. "I didn't marry your money. I married your heart, and that's still here." Her words hit something deep inside me. The next morning, she did something that changed everything. She sold her engagement ring. I didn't even know until I saw the pawnshop receipt on the counter. I tried to protest, but she stopped me. "This is our investment," she said. "We'll buy it back someday." With that money, I launched our first small batch of products, cheap packaging, rough edges, but real. Every label, every sale, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. We didn't know if it would work. All we had was belief, and the stubbornness to keep going when everything said, "Stop." But destiny has a way of testing you. Hardest right before it changes everything. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day that usually meant disappointment. I was sitting at my desk, refreshing our online store dashboard for the 100th time, when I saw something strange. A massive order from a retail chain I'd only ever dreamed of working with. I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened my email, there it was, a message from their procurement manager saying they'd discovered our product through social media and wanted to discuss distribution. I remember shouting, "Rachel, come here." She ran in, hair tied up, still wearing her work uniform. When she read the email, she froze, then started laughing and crying all at once. We didn't have champagne, so we celebrated with leftover pizza and cheap soda, dancing barefoot on the kitchen floor. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest lifted. It felt like the universe had finally noticed us. Within weeks, things changed. Orders poured in faster than we could fulfill them. Rachel quit her job to help me full-time, and our tiny apartment became a warehouse. We worked late into the night, surrounded by boxes, sticky notes, and the smell of printer ink. It was chaos, but it was our chaos. Then, out of nowhere, a familiar name appeared in my inbox. It was from my father's assistant, congratulating me on the recent business success and saying my father wanted to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. I just stared at the screen. Heart pounding, Rachel walked over and read the message. She didn't say a word at first, then whispered. They finally noticed, but she didn't sound happy because we both knew they weren't reaching out of love. They were reaching out because, for the first time, I was no longer beneath them. I was competition. 2 weeks after that email, I got a call from a number I hadn't seen in years, my mother's. For a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. When I finally answered, her voice was warm, overly so. "Darling," she said as if no time had passed, "we've been following your success. Your father and I are so proud." The words sounded rehearsed, like something she'd practiced in the mirror. Pride. That word used to mean everything to me. But now it felt hollow. Still, a small, naive part of me wanted to believe her. She told me my father wanted to meet for dinner, to celebrate how far I'd come. Rachel watched me from across the room, arms folded. "You know why they're calling now," she said softly. "It's not pride, it's convenience." She was right, of course, but curiosity, or maybe old wounds, pulled me in. We agreed to meet at a high-end restaurant downtown, one my parents used to take me to when I was younger. The same maitre d' recognized my father instantly, greeting him like royalty. My mother kissed my cheek and smiled at Rachel. "You look lovely," she said, stretching the compliment as thin as glass. Over dinner, they spoke as if the past decade hadn't happened. My father asked about our company, phrasing it in a way that made it sound like he'd been part of it all along. My mother mentioned how our connections could help us expand internationally. They laughed, reminisced, and painted a false history where we'd never been estranged. Rachel stayed quiet, polite but distant. I caught her hand under the table, squeezing it gently, because deep down I knew this wasn't reconciliation. It was recruitment. When we left the restaurant that night, Rachel turned to me and said, "They don't miss you, they miss control." And as much as it hurt, I knew she was right. The following week, my father invited me to a business presentation at his corporate headquarters. He said it would be a chance to align visions. Against Rachel's better judgment and my own gut feeling, I went. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Polished marble floors, the smell of expensive cologne, people moving like clockwork. It was like stepping back into the life I'd been cut out of. Only now, I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. Inside the boardroom, my father was surrounded by executives and investors. On the large screen behind him was a presentation. Our company logo, our product photos, our story, but rewritten. The slides made it seem like he had guided the brand's growth, that his firm had mentored me through it all. My jaw clenched as I read the captions beneath our photos. Family business success through legacy values. When I confronted him, he didn't even blink. "This is how business works, son. We're simply leveraging your name for both our benefits." Rachel, who had come to support me, sat frozen beside me. Then my mother added softly, "You should be grateful, dear. We're elevating your brand to the level it deserves." That was the moment something inside me broke. Years of striving for their approval, all of it felt like ash. Rachel stood abruptly, her voice shaking. "You didn't build this. You buried him, and he dug himself out." Her words cut through the silence like a blade. My mother gasped. My father's face turned to stone. I took Rachel's hand and said, "We're done here." As we left the room, my father called out, "You'll regret this." Outside, in the parking lot, Rachel started crying. Not from sadness, but rage. I pulled her close, realizing this was our lowest point. We hadn't just been betrayed, we'd been erased. But as I held her, one thought burned in my chest. They'd stolen my narrative once. Never again. After that meeting, something in me snapped into focus. The humiliation, the anger, it all hardened into purpose. Rachel and I went home that night, tore down everything that reminded us of my family, and started again from zero. We rebranded, rebuilt, and poured every ounce of our energy into expanding the business on our terms. I stopped chasing validation and started chasing results. For months, we barely slept. Days blurred into nights filled with coffee cups, late shipments, and endless brainstorming sessions. Rachel handled logistics while I reached out to new distributors. We reinvested every penny, taking no shortcuts, no loans, no outside investors. I'd stare at spreadsheets until my vision blurred, hearing my father's voice in my head, "You can't do this without us." Each time I'd whisper back, "Watch me." Then came the breakthrough. A viral feature in a national magazine called us the self-made couple redefining entrepreneurship. Overnight, sales tripled. The story of our rise, two people building from nothing after being cut off, captured hearts everywhere. Investors we once begged for attention were now calling us. We bought our first office space, hired staff, and opened community programs to train underprivileged youth, something Rachel had always dreamed of. When we moved into our new home, a modest but beautiful house overlooking the city, she stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "This," she whispered, "is what freedom looks like." I wrapped my arm around her and said, "Our kids will never have to beg for love. They'll grow up knowing respect can't be bought." In that moment, I realized we hadn't just built a company. We'd built an empire of our own values, one made of grit, love, and defiance. But just as we settled into the peace we'd earned, the past came knocking again. This time, with desperation instead of pride. It was a quiet Sunday morning when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved, but I knew it immediately. I froze, coffee halfway to my lips. It was my father. For a second, I almost didn't answer. Then, curiosity, or maybe old habit, got the better of me. "Hello," I said cautiously. There was silence, then a shaky breath. "Son," my father's voice cracked the first time I'd ever heard it sound fragile. "Your mother, she's not well. We've been going through a difficult time. The business, things aren't the same anymore." I said nothing, waiting for the real reason behind the call, and then it came. "We'd like to see you and meet our grandchildren." The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked at Rachel, who was sitting on the porch with our two kids, laughing as they played with their toy cars. For a moment, I saw the contrast, the warmth of the family I'd built versus the cold one that had broken me. Later that night, I told Rachel about the call. She didn't react with anger, just quiet understanding. "They're not reaching out because they've changed," she said. "They're reaching out because they've fallen." I knew she was right, but something inside me, the child who once begged for approval, still ached to believe it was more. I spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between resentment and forgiveness. By morning, I'd made up my mind. "They can meet us," I told Rachel. "But on my terms," she nodded slowly. "Then make sure those terms remind them exactly who you became without them." As I held her hand, I realized this wasn't just about reconciliation. It was about reclaiming the story they'd tried to erase. The day my parents came over, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that feels heavy with memory. Rachel had set the table, our kids' drawings framed proudly on the walls. Everything about our home felt alive and warm, the complete opposite of the cold mansion I grew up in. When the doorbell rang, my heart raced. For a moment, I considered not answering. But then I remembered Rachel's words. "Make sure they see who you became without them." When I opened the door, they looked smaller than I remembered. My father's confident posture was gone, replaced by something uncertain. My mother's elegance was still there, but dulled by time and guilt. My kids peeked from behind my leg, curious. "These must be your children," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "They are," I said calmly. "Your grandchildren." We sat in awkward silence for a while. My father tried to make small talk about business, but I stopped him. "We're not here to talk about profits," I said. "You wanted to meet your family, so meet them." My son climbed onto Rachel's lap, giggling, his laughter filling the room. I watched my parents' eyes follow him, and for the first time, I saw something genuine. Regret. My mother finally spoke. "We were wrong," she said, tears welling. "About her. About you. About everything," I nodded slowly. "You didn't just lose me back then," I said quietly. "You lost the chance to know what love without conditions looks like." They both sat speechless, eyes lowered. I didn't need revenge. Their silence was enough. As they left, my father turned and said, "You built something incredible." I looked at Rachel, then back at him. "Yes," I said. "We did." As the door closed behind them, Rachel slipped her hand into mine. "Are you okay?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "For the first time in my life," I said, completely. And just like that, the son who once chased his parents' approval finally stopped running and stood tall in his own story.